The Pacific Ocean was a geographical trap. An armada could only strike as far as its supply lines allowed, and the immense distance of the ocean threatened to destroy the momentum of the American advance. An American carrier was damaged, the fleet needed fuel, and the nearest full-scale shipyard was far behind the front. Then the Navy built a base that did not need to stay on land. They engineered a paradox, an entirely floating logistics hub anchored in the middle of nowhere. But how do you supply, rearm, and repair an entire armada without pouring a traditional concrete pier? To answer that, the military had to completely defy the physical limitations of naval warfare. For centuries, maritime strategy relied on an ironclad rule. Fleets require massive, permanent, deep-water ports on solid land to survive. Dry docks, vast warehouses, heavy cranes, and industrial rail lines took years to build, anchoring ships to predictable coastal cities. But the Pacific Theater broke that fundamental rule. The American island-hopping campaign was moving at a relentless pace. Every time the fleet captured a stronghold and pushed west, their established infrastructure was left further behind. A warship running low on heavy artillery shells or suffering battle damage faced a crippling voyage of thousands of miles just to reach a fully equipped shipyard. This geographical drag threatened to stall the entire offensive. Instead of slowing down the war to pour concrete and build another terrestrial base, engineers and logisticians proposed a radical alternative, a massive hybrid port that could effectively follow the fleet. They looked at a remote coral lagoon called Ulithi and envisioned an unprecedented industrial powerhouse constructed almost entirely on the water. It would be a city of steel that bypassed the shore, bringing the sheer scale of a major naval yard directly to the front lines. To understand how this impossible blueprint was approved and how it actually worked in practice, we must look at the severe tactical crisis that forced the Navy to completely rethink the geography of maritime logistics. By the late summer of 1944, the United States Navy was a victim of its own unprecedented success. The Fast Carrier Task Force had smashed through the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, systematically dismantled Japanese outer defenses, and successfully seized the Marianas. The spearhead of the American Armada was now pushing deep into the Western Pacific, preparing for the monumental campaigns to retake the Philippines and ultimately strike toward the Japanese home islands. But this relentless, driving speed triggered an invisible, suffocating crisis that no amount of frontline firepower could immediately solve. The offensive was simply moving much faster than permanent forward naval bases could be built. To understand the severity of this problem, you have to look at the tactical map of the Pacific in late 1944. The distances involved are not just large, they are inherently hostile to military operations. Pearl Harbor, the primary fortress and heavy shipyard of the Pacific Fleet, was now over 3,000 miles behind the active combat zone. Even the advanced anchorages seized earlier in the year, like Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands, were rapidly slipping into the rear echelons, situated more than 1,000 miles east of the new front lines. Warships are not self-sustaining fortresses. They are highly complex industrial machines with a ferocious, unending appetite. A single carrier task force, maneuvering at combat speeds, burns through tens of thousands of barrels of thick, black bunker oil in a matter of days. Cruisers and battleships rapidly deplete their magazines of massive, armor-piercing shells during shore bombardments. Destroyers burn through depth charges and anti-aircraft ammunition, shielding the fleet from air attacks. Furthermore, sustained combat operations inevitably result in damaged machinery. Boilers blow out, radar arrays fail, and enemy bombs or torpedoes tear open armored hulls. Because of the vast geography of the Pacific, every time a warship exhausted its supplies or sustained battle damage, it faced a grueling mathematical reality. It had to turn its bow away from the enemy and steam east. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a severe hemorrhage of combat power. Imagine a heavy cruiser needing emergency hull repairs, or an aircraft carrier requiring a massive replenishment of aviation fuel and specialized ordnance. To get what it needed, that vessel had to decouple from the strike force and begin a transit of weeks. At a standard cruising speed, crossing 2,000 miles of ocean takes several days just in one direction. Add the time spent waiting in a harbor, the time required to load thousands of tons of cargo, or patch a blasted hull, and the long return voyage back to the combat zone. A single rotation for basic resupply and repair could strip a capital ship from the battle line for a month or more. Worse, a battle-damaged ship limping alone across the open ocean was prime prey for prowling enemy submarines. In the theater of naval warfare, presence is everything. If a third of your fleet is constantly in transit to and from distant supply depots, your effective fighting strength is artificially slashed. The operational tempo, the rhythm of strikes, invasions, and bombardments, relies entirely on sustained pressure. If the Armada had to constantly pause, fracture, and retreat across the ocean just to keep its engines running and its sailors fed, the momentum of the entire Pacific campaign would inevitably collapse. The offensive would stall. The Japanese High Command understood this geographic tyranny perfectly. Their defensive strategy heavily banked on the vastness of the Pacific, stretching American supply lines until they snapped. They fully anticipated that the U.S. Navy would arrive in the critical waters of the Philippine Sea, exhausted, undersupplied, and numerically weakened by the sheer logistical drag of the ocean. The military could not simply build their way out of this trap using traditional methods. The United States possessed some of the greatest industrial port facilities on the planet, with the shipyards of California and Washington State churning out new tonnage at record speeds. The massive drydocks at Pearl Harbor were highly capable of resurrecting shattered battleships. The problem was not a lack of ports. The problem was that ports are anchored to bedrock. You cannot move a concrete pier. You cannot tow a terrestrial warehouse. When the military tried to construct new, permanent staging bases on newly captured islands, the process proved painfully slow. It required fleets of cargo ships just to bring in the cement, earth-moving equipment, steel pilings, and heavy cranes. It required thousands of engineering troops working for months to carve out deep water channels, lay down rail lines, and erect shore-based repair facilities. By the time a new island base was finally operational and ready to support the fleet, the combat vanguard had already advanced another 1,000 miles. The permanent base was completely obsolete as a frontline hub before the paint was even dry. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his logistical commanders recognized they were approaching a hard limit. The impending operations to liberate the Philippines and strike toward Okinawa would require the greatest concentration of naval power in human history. They were managing hundreds of combat vessels, thousands of aircraft, and tens of thousands of sailors, all requiring a daily mountain of supplies and technical maintenance. To support an armada of that staggering scale, the Navy could not rely on a shuttle service stretching all the way back to Hawaii or the Marshalls. They needed a colossal forward staging area, and they needed it immediately. They needed a place where the fleet could drop anchor, replenish its magazines, conduct heavy repairs, and cycle its crews, all while remaining within immediate striking distance of the next objective. Planners scoured the charts of the Western Pacific, searching for a very specific geographic anomaly. They were not looking for a large landmass. A large island meant dense jungles, mountains, and potentially a massive, entrenched enemy garrison that would take months and thousands of lives to clear. Instead, they were looking for water. They needed a massive, naturally protected, deep water lagoon. It had to be vast enough to hold a fleet of unprecedented size. It had to have a sandy bottom capable of holding heavy anchors. It had to be surrounded by a protective barrier reef to break the heavy ocean swells and provide a physical shield against enemy submarines. And crucially, it had to be located in the exact right tactical corridor. The eyes of the naval planners moved across the map, bypassing heavily fortified enemy strongholds, until they settled on a tiny, isolated speck in the Caroline Islands. To the untrained eye, it was barely a feature on the map, just a faint outline of coral reefs surrounding a patch of blue water. It was a sunken volcanic rim where the central peak had eroded away millions of years ago, leaving only an enormous, teardrop-shaped lagoon. It was called Ulithi. It offered almost no dry land, just a few square miles of usable dirt scattered across a ring of narrow, palm-covered islets. But what it lacked in land, it made up for in protected water. The lagoon stretched roughly 19 miles long and 10 miles wide, making it one of the largest natural anchorages on the planet. It was exactly what the military desperately needed. But locating a deep lagoon was only the first step. Turning an empty stretch of water into a fully functioning naval base would require a complete reinvention of maritime logistics. In September 1944, American forces arrived at the Ulithi Atoll to claim this critical patch of the Pacific. They did not find a completely deserted wilderness, nor did they capture a heavily fortified stronghold. A local population of islanders still inhabited a few of the narrow coral strips, living largely as they had for generations. Militarily and industrially, however, the atoll was a blank slate. The Japanese Navy had previously utilized the lagoon as a temporary staging anchorage earlier in the war, but they had never invested the resources to develop it. Recognizing their overextended defensive lines, Japanese forces had largely abandoned the position before the American spearhead even arrived. The occupation was remarkably swift, with American troops securing the perimeter islands and minesweepers meticulously clearing the entrance channels. The prize was now firmly in American hands. As naval commanders sailed into the vast anchorage, they could look out across a tremendous expanse of perfectly sheltered water. The geography functioned exactly as the planners had hoped. The thick, submerged coral reefs absorbed the crushing kinetic energy of the open ocean swells, keeping the waters inside the lagoon deceptively calm and manageable for small craft operations. More importantly, that continuous barrier reef acted as a natural, impenetrable anti-submarine net, restricting underwater access to a few narrow, easily guarded channels. It was a perfectly protected marine environment, squarely in the path of the American advance. But as the first warships dropped their heavy steel anchors into the white sand, the stark, unforgiving reality of their prize became obvious. A pristine lagoon is not a naval base. It is simply a safe place to park. Standing on the beaches of islets like Açores or Falalope and looking back at the water, the sheer scale of what was missing was daunting. There were absolutely no deep-water concrete piers for a battleship to secure its mooring lines against. There were no towering industrial steel cranes waiting to hoist damaged artillery barrels, replace shattered flight deck elevators, or transfer heavy cargo. There were no sprawling, buried tank farms holding the millions of gallons of aviation gas and black bunker oil the fleet desperately required to maintain its offensive momentum. There were no shore-based warehouses stacked with spare radar components, fresh drinking water, or thousands of tons of refrigerated food. And most critically, there was not a single shore-based dry dock capable of lifting a bleeding torpedo destroyer out of the saltwater to expose its damaged hull for emergency welders. The Navy had successfully solved their geographic problem, capturing the absolute perfect location for a forward staging area. But they had conquered a location, not a facility. Building a traditional, permanent port of the magnitude required to support the massive Pacific Fleet would demand leveling what little land existed, dredging deep channels to the shore, pouring tens of thousands of tons of concrete, and waiting years for construction to finish. The fast carriers did not have years. They barely had weeks before the sprawling invasion of the Philippines would demand a continuous, uninterrupted flow of ammunition, fuel, and heavy repair capabilities. Planners were staring at an empty, quiet stretch of calm blue water, separated from the industrial might of the American mainland by thousands of miles. The fleet was advancing, and its logistical appetite would be ravenous. If you secure the perfect deep-water anchorage, where do you find the fuel terminals, floating dry docks, repair shops, and specialized personnel to actually make it function? The answer materialized in the form of an entirely new classification of naval power, a sprawling, industrialized armada designated as Service Squadron 10. Commanded by Commodore Worrall R. Carter, this was not a traditional fighting squadron of heavily armored cruisers or swift destroyers. It was a highly compartmentalized, synchronized network of auxiliary ships specifically designed to replicate every single function of a massive terrestrial seaport, but executed entirely over open water. Carter's monumental task was to take the heavy industrial capacity of the American coastline, mount it onto steel hulls, and anchor it securely inside the Ulithi Lagoon. Service Squadron 10 was never just one miraculous, do-it-all supership. It was a vast, floating ecosystem comprised of specialized vessels, heavy hull repair ships featuring onboard metallurgical foundries, massive floating dry docks, capable of lifting destroyers out of the water, specialized ammunition tenders, refrigerated provision ships, high-capacity water distillers, heavy fleet tugs, and dozens of shallow-draft lighters and barges. When fully deployed and operating at peak capacity to support the advancing Pacific campaigns, this logistical web would eventually encompass roughly 250 auxiliary vessels of varying types. However, this staggering armada was never permanently stationed exclusively inside the Ulithi Lagoon. The genius of Carter's system was its fluid mobility. Units were constantly shifting, rotating between Ulithi, rear echelon depots, and other forward anchorages based on the highly unpredictable rhythm of the war. They were the unsung, grease-stained lifeline of the fast carrier task force, a mobile industrial city that could effectively follow the combat spearhead across the ocean. The most immediate, unforgiving tyrant of modern mechanized naval warfare was fuel. Without millions of gallons of thick, black bunker oil for the superheated steam boilers and high-octane aviation gasoline for the carrier decks, the greatest warships on the planet were nothing more than a collection of drifting steel targets. To solve this continuous hemorrhage of energy, Carter's command engineered a brilliant, three-tiered liquid supply chain that stretched completely across the Pacific Ocean. First, heavy commercial-style merchant tankers, massive, deep-draft vessels, acted as the transoceanic arteries. They loaded millions of gallons of highly explosive petroleum at massive refineries in California or the Caribbean and made the long, unglamorous, and often dangerous voyage across the open Pacific. But these massive, sluggish ships could not easily maneuver around a crowded, high-traffic anchorage to service individual warships, nor were they designed to keep pace with a combat fleet. Therefore, when these heavy transport tankers finally arrived at the Ulithi Atoll, they did not pump their volatile cargo into deeply buried underground shore tanks. There were no shore tanks. Instead, they pumped their massive cargo directly into large station tankers that were permanently anchored inside the lagoon. These station tankers acted as the floating fuel terminals of the new base. From there, the third tier of the system took over. Smaller, highly maneuverable service vessels and yard oilers would carefully pull alongside the anchored station tankers, fill their internal holds, and then weave through the heavily congested anchorage to tie up directly against the armored flanks of the resting battleships and aircraft carriers. Through heavy, reinforced rubber hoses, fighting the chop of the lagoon water, they pumped the lifeblood of the fleet directly into the combat vessels. But the Navy leadership recognized that even forcing the fleet to return to Ulithi for every drop of fuel cost precious time. To keep the unrelenting operational pressure on the Japanese defenses, they pushed the logistical envelope even further with specialized units like Service Squadron 6. This separate organization mastered the highly dangerous, choreographed art of underway replenishment. Specially designed and rigged fleet oilers would steam out of the Ulithi Lagoon and rendezvous with the combat task forces in the open ocean. Steaming side by side at high speeds in rough, unpredictable seas, they passed heavy fuel hoses and tension cables across the churning water, allowing the fighting ships to top off their bunkers without ever dropping anchor or slowing their advance. This at-sea replenishment was strictly limited to the transfer of fuel, critical ammunition, and basic provisions. Contrary to popular myth, massive floating dry docks and heavy repair ships were never dragged alongside attacking carriers in the open ocean. Any heavy structural repair fundamentally required the relatively calm, protected waters of the Ulithi anchorage. But for fuel, this seamlessly integrated system, station tankers serving as reservoirs in the lagoon, and fleet oilers delivering on the move, effectively severed the combat fleet's absolute reliance on distant coastal refineries, allowing them to strike faster and deeper than ever before. Yet, a modern warship requires much more than just petroleum to survive. It requires literal mountains of dry cargo, heavy, high-explosive munitions, delicate replacement parts, and thousands of tons of food to sustain the men living within its steel bulkheads. Transporting this endless mountain of material across the ocean was only half the logistical battle. The true, grinding friction of war lay in actually unloading it without a port. On October 1st, 1944, the 18th Special Construction Battalion arrived at Ulithi to manage this crushing physical burden. These men, operating essentially as highly trained naval stevedores, were tasked with running a bustling, high-volume port that possessed virtually no solid ground. They did not have the luxury of returning to wooden barracks on a quiet, tropical beach at the end of an exhausting shift. They lived entirely on the water, housed in massive, non-self-propelled concrete floating barracks, that had been painstakingly towed across the ocean. Their daily commute consisted of climbing down heavy rope cargo nets into Higgins boats or small motor launches to be shuttled out to the various freighters anchored throughout the sprawling lagoon. The raw physical labor required to move cargo at Ulithi was staggering in its complexity. Without traditional deep-water concrete docks, large supply ships could not simply tie up and offload their holds directly onto waiting trucks or industrial rail lines. Everything entering the lagoon had to be double-handled. Heavy cargo ships dropped their anchors in the deep water, and the men of the 18th Battalion brought specialized barges, lighters, and small tenders alongside their towering steel hulls. Using the transport ship's own mechanical booms and steam winches, the stevedores hoisted heavy wooden crates, spare aircraft engines sealed in cosmoline, fragile radar vacuum tubes, and massive canvas sacks of mail down onto the bobbing decks of the barges. These heavily loaded barges were then hooked to small tugs and towed across the choppy lagoon to the combat ships, where the exact same precarious, dangerous hoisting process had to be repeated in reverse. Moving high explosives, sensitive artillery fuses, and heavy machinery in the sweltering, suffocating tropical heat, while two massive steel hulls constantly ground against each other in the ocean's swell, was inherently deadly work. A snapped winch cable under tension, a sudden rogue wave, or a misjudged swing of the crane could easily crush a man between the hulls, or drop a 2-ton pallet of armor-piercing shells directly into the sea. Yet the operational tempo demanded by the front lines was absolutely relentless. The fleet was always hungry, and the stevedores could never stop. Using this improvised, highly dangerous floating transfer system, the cargo crews at Ulithi managed an astonishing throughput. Official military records from the period indicate that they were actively moving an average of roughly 20,000 tons of critical cargo every single month. To sustain the health and morale of the crews, they managed dedicated reefer ships, massive floating refrigerators that transferred deep frozen meat, fresh vegetables, and perishables to ensure the sailors manning the anti-aircraft batteries had adequate nutrition to fight off severe fatigue and tropical disease. They operated floating ship stores, providing everything from fresh cotton uniforms and heavy boots to basic medical supplies and thousands of gallons of paint. Every single item required to keep a highly mechanized, floating city of tens of thousands of men alive, fighting, and repairing their vessels was carefully cataloged, transferred by hand and winch, and distributed entirely over the open water of the lagoon. However, to picture the Ulithi base solely as a dense cluster of ships floating over a pristine, untouched coral reef is to fundamentally misunderstand the sheer engineering flexibility of the American military machine. While the primary function of the logistics base was indeed afloat, the efficiency of the lagoon was deeply dependent on a network of critical, hastily constructed shore facilities. The Navy's Seabees, the legendary combat engineering battalions, were immediately deployed to the narrow, scattered strips of dry land surrounding the anchorage. They understood that certain logistical and administrative functions simply could not be efficiently or safely maintained on steel hulls indefinitely. The most pressing, immediate need was the establishment of an airfield. The massive fleet anchored in the lagoon required constant, localized air cover, anti-submarine reconnaissance patrols, and a fast, reliable courier link to the rest of the Pacific theater. The Seabees descended on the tiny islet of Falalap, which already possessed a rudimentary, abandoned Japanese airstrip hidden in the brush. They brought ashore heavy armored bulldozers, diesel graders, and thousands of tons of crushed coral to aggressively expand the footprint of the island. Dense tropical trees were rapidly leveled, and the jagged coral surface was violently pulverized, rolled flat, and sealed to create a hard runway. The engineering pace was frantic, driven by the immediate vulnerability of the anchored fleet. Just 15 days after the Seabees began their brutal mechanical assault on the terrain, the first American aircraft touched down safely on the newly laid surface. Within a mere 27 days, the entire runway complex was declared fully operational, capable of handling heavy multi-engine transport planes and providing a defensive fighter umbrella over the lagoon. But the Seabees didn't stop at simply paving a runway. They rapidly transformed the scattered perimeter islets into a highly specialized, land-based support network. They constructed sprawling shore-based warehouses to securely hold materials that were too bulky, heavy, or dangerously volatile to to keep indefinitely on floating barges. They erected a large, comprehensive fleet hospital on the solid ground, providing a stable, motion-free environment for naval surgeons to operate on the severely wounded sailors pulled from the distant combat zones. Perhaps most critically to the survival of the fleet, they tackled the relentless, insatiable demand for fresh water. High-pressure steam turbine warships consume millions of gallons of highly purified water just to run their massive boilers, an amount completely separate from the drinking, cooking, and bathing needs of the thousands of crewmen. To supplement the fleet's own internal evaporators, the Seabees built massive industrial shore-based water distillation plants, sucking in the salt water of the Pacific Ocean, rapidly boiling out the corrosive salt, and pumping the fresh, pure water out to waiting barges for distribution. To seamlessly connect this vital onshore infrastructure to the floating city anchored in the deep water, the engineers had to solve the severe problem of the shallow coral reefs that physically prevented deep draft ships from safely approaching the beaches. They utilized standardized steel pontoon sections, bolting the heavy steel boxes together to create long, highly flexible floating piers that reached out from the sand into the deeper navigable channels. To securely anchor these flexible piers against the strong tidal currents and fierce tropical storms that frequently battered the atoll, the engineers filled the terminal pontoon sections with thousands of pounds of local sand and gravel, deliberately sinking the heavy steel boxes directly onto the coral shelf to act as immovable, permanent anchors. This brutal but brilliant engineering created a seamless physical interface between the shore and the sea. The true strategic strength of Ulithi was never that it was entirely floating, but that it was a perfectly balanced hybrid, a massive, adaptable, floating repair and supply system firmly anchored to a highly efficient, purpose-built shore infrastructure. Thousands of miles away, deep inside the heavily fortified command bunkers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, strategic planners were actively grappling with a tactical nightmare that defied their most fundamental understanding of naval warfare. The Japanese defensive doctrine for the Pacific had been meticulously calculated based on the unforgiving, rigid mathematics of distance. They knew exactly how much fuel an American heavy cruiser burned when maneuvering at 20 knots. They knew the precise ammunition capacity of an Iowa-class battleship bombarding a shoreline. They carefully measured the thousands of miles of hostile open ocean stretching between the massive American shipyards in Pearl Harbor or the West Coast and the new, bloody front lines advancing into the Philippine Sea. According to every established law of maritime logistics taught in the naval academies, the American offensive should have been violently grinding to a halt. The physical limits of the internal combustion engine and the immense time lag of the trans-Pacific supply chain dictated that the United States Navy simply could not sustain heavy, continuous combat operations so far from a permanent, concrete base. The Japanese High Command fully expected the American Armada to stretch its fragile supply lines until they snapped, anticipating that the fleet would arrive at the inner defensive ring utterly exhausted, running on the absolute fumes of their fuel reserves and highly vulnerable to a decisive, annihilating counterattack. But the expected culmination point never came. Instead of slowing down the consolidate and resupply, the violent tempo of American carrier airstrikes and devastating shore bombardments only accelerated. The Japanese realized with creeping, cold dread that the mathematical equation they had staked their empire upon was fundamentally broken. The American fleet was not periodically withdrawing to Hawaii to rearm its magazines. They were not spending critical weeks in transit, bleeding operational momentum. Somehow, the enemy was maintaining a continuous, crushing pressure on the defensive perimeter. While Japanese aerial reconnaissance was heavily suppressed by American fighters, the overarching strategic reality became undeniable through sheer deduction. The Americans had not just brought a massive fleet across the ocean, they had somehow brought the entire port with them. A colossal logistical anchor had been driven into the seabed, right on the immediate doorstep of the Japanese Empire. The ultimate tyranny of distance, which the Japanese had confidently counted on as their greatest, most insurmountable ally, had been systematically neutralized by a sprawling, improvised city of floating steel, sunken pontoon piers, and relentless industrial synchronization. The sheer physical effort required by the Americans to manifest this reality was staggering in its scope. Men worked relentlessly around the clock, stripped to the waist in the suffocating, humid tropical heat, continuously battling the highly corrosive effects of salt spray on raw steel and sensitive machinery. They defied the natural environment every single hour, moving thousands of tons of high explosives, delicate electronics, and heavy machinery without the luxury of traditional, stable shore cranes or solid concrete docks beneath their boots. Every single day at Ulithi was a relentless, exhausting fight against the clock, with the men fully knowing that a delayed shipment of high-octane aviation fuel or a stalled repair job on a destroyer could directly cost the lives of Marines pinned down on a beachhead hundreds of miles away. The creation of Service Squadron 10 and the rapid, aggressive development of the Ulithi anchorage brilliantly solved the most acute existential supply crisis of the Pacific War. It provided the heavy logistical muscle that allowed the fast carrier task force to maintain a permanent, suffocating grip on the Japanese perimeter. But in brilliantly solving one unprecedented geographical problem, the military had inadvertently engineered an entirely new, terrifying threat. By actively concentrating the logistical lifeblood of the entire Pacific Fleet, virtually every drop of spare fuel, every replacement shell, and the only dry docks within thousands of miles, into a single, enclosed geographic location, they had created an unimaginably valuable target. The Ulithi Lagoon was no longer just a secluded, peaceful coral atoll. It was a 19-mile-long powder keg waiting for a spark. Hundreds of massive ships, millions of gallons of highly explosive aviation fuel riding low in the water, thousands of tons of heavy artillery shells stacked in the holds, and the utterly irreplaceable floating repair infrastructure were all crammed into one confined lagoon, packed side by side in dense rows. The tactical advantage of this incredible logistical density was absolute, providing unmatched operational speed, but the strategic risk was equally absolute. If a determined enemy could somehow slip past the outer perimeter defenses, penetrate the coral barrier reef, and strike the densely packed heart of this floating city, the resulting catastrophic chain reaction of exploding ammunition ships and burning tankers could instantly cripple the entire American offensive capability for months. The logistical triumph of Ulithi has successfully bridged the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, but it had also gathered the fleet's greatest, most explosive vulnerabilities into a single, terrifyingly fragile basket. On the morning of November 20th, 1944, that theoretical nightmare became a violent reality. The vast ocean distance and the protective coral barrier were no longer enough to shield the Armada. Slipping silently beneath the surface, a Japanese kaiten, a meticulously engineered, human-guided suicide torpedo, navigated the treacherous entrance channels and successfully penetrated the absolute heart of the American anchorage. The pilot steered his weapon through the dense grid of anchored warships, bypassing the perimeter screens, and zeroed in on a critical node of the logistical network, the fleet oiler USS Mississinewa. She was effectively a floating bomb, her internal holds heavily laden with over 400,000 gallons of highly volatile aviation gasoline and nearly 3 million gallons of thick bunker oil. When the kaiten detonated against her lower hull, the result was instantaneous and catastrophic. A colossal pillar of fire and violently churning black smoke erupted hundreds of feet into the tropical sky, completely dwarfing the surrounding vessels. The underwater shockwave rolled across the calm waters of the lagoon, violently rattling the steel bulkheads of adjacent warships. Within seconds, the massive oiler was transformed into an uncontrollable, towering inferno. As her structural integrity failed, blazing petroleum began to spill directly onto the surface of the lagoon. It created a lethal, expanding slick of liquid fire, carried by the ocean breeze, that directly threatened to ignite every supply ship and combat vessel anchored downwind. The desperate scramble to contain the flames and move adjacent ships away from the expanding heat radius proved the extreme danger of packing so many vital resources into one densely confined space. The destruction of the Mississinewa forced a chilling realization upon the Pacific Fleet. The supreme logistical sanctuary was definitively vulnerable. The Japanese had proven they could reach across the ocean, bypass the natural defensive reefs, and strike the fleet at its most concentrated and explosive point. The illusion of absolute safety inside the Ulithi Lagoon
evaporated alongside the burning oiler. This successful strike immediately forced an even more critical calculation. Sinking a stationary logistics vessel was a devastating blow, but what would happen when the enemy inevitably struck a primary combatant?
If a heavily armored capital ship was severely crippled right inside its own sanctuary, its flight decks shattered, and its internal framing violently compromised, could this improvised network of barges, tenders, and floating foundries actually resurrect it on the water? Or would the Navy's grand logistical experiment fail its ultimate test, proving that heavily damaged warships still required a desperate, month-long retreat to a mainland shipyard? The definitive answer arrived on the evening of March 11th, 1945. Under the cover of darkness, a twin-engine Japanese kamikaze bomber slipped through the defensive radar nets and plunged directly into the crowded Ulithi anchorage. It slammed violently into the starboard aft section of the aircraft carrier USS Randolph. The explosion tore a massive, jagged crater through the steel runway, destroying the aft staging area and sending sheets of flaming aviation fuel cascading through the hangar deck below. Once the damage control team suffocated the raging fires, the raw structural reality was exposed. A fleet carrier with a collapsed flight deck is combat ineffective. It can neither launch nor recover a strike group. According to centuries of established naval doctrine, the Randolph was out of the war. Standard protocol dictated a slow, vulnerable retreat to the heavy shipyards of Pearl Harbor or the West Coast for months of reconstruction. But the monumental invasion of Okinawa was rapidly approaching, and the Navy could not afford to lose a single operational flight deck. Instead of ordering the crippled carrier eastward, commanders instructed the heavy repair ship USS Jason to maneuver directly alongside the blackened, smoking hull. The Jason was essentially a floating heavy industrial plant, and its arrival triggered a relentless race against time. Hundreds of shipfitters, metallurgists, and welders swarmed the ruined aft section, working around the clock in the suffocating tropical humidity. They did not have the luxury of ordering perfectly machined replacement parts from a mainland factory. They had to improvise, using whatever the floating supply chain could provide. To bridge the massive, gaping void in the flight deck, engineering crews hoisted 20 tons of heavy 12-inch steel I-beams across the carrier's warped framing. These massive supports were not standard naval issue. They had been salvaged from a dismantled Japanese sugar mill on the island of Saipan, shipped across the ocean, and repurposed for American naval architecture. For over 2 weeks, the lagoon echoed with the deafening roar of pneumatic hammers and grinding metal. Blinding showers of sparks rained down into the hangar deck 24 hours a day as welders fused 30 tons of raw steel plating to reinforce the ship's shattered skeleton. Over this newly forged steel grid, carpenters systematically laid down 7,500 feet of fresh wooden decking to recreate the smooth, critical runway required for aircraft operations. This staggering feat of maritime engineering did not mean the floating base was omnipotent. Naval logisticians readily admitted the strict physical limits of their improvised city. If a massive capital ship suffered catastrophic, hull-breaking damage, like a torpedo severing the main keel or permanently flooding the primary engine rooms, it still required a massive terrestrial drydock to prevent the ship from snapping in half. The advanced floating drydocks at Ulithi could easily lift a bleeding destroyer completely out of the salt water, but they could not hoist a flooded 30,000-ton fleet carrier. For the Randolph, however, the hybrid floating infrastructure was exactly what was needed. In a breathtaking display of industrial resilience, the gaping crater was entirely erased. Just 19 days after a kamikaze had effectively blown her stern apart, the USS Randolph weighed anchor. Her flight deck was flawlessly restored. Her structural integrity was fully intact, and she was ready to rejoin the fast carrier task force. The forward logistics hub had successfully absorbed a devastating blow to a major warship and returned it to the battle line without ever touching the American mainland, proving its ultimate value just as the most punishing campaign of the Pacific War was about to begin. The resurrection of the Randolph was not an isolated miracle. It was a testament to a logistical system that had finally reached its absolute peak. By the time that repaired carrier weighed anchor in late March 1945, the sheer industrial gravity inside the Ulithi Lagoon had reached an almost incomprehensible scale, developing in parallel with the brutal, grinding Philippine campaign.
The anchorage had steadily transformed from an empty coral ring into the critical staging ground for the final, monumental push toward Okinawa. According to Commodore Carter's official history, on March 13th, just 2 days after the kamikaze strike, there were exactly 647 ships riding at anchor inside the lagoon. This staggering figure did not merely represent the specialized auxiliaries of Service Squadron 10. This was the combined mass of the fighting fleet, the transport convoys, and their massive logistical shadow, all gathered in one place. As additional amphibious assault forces continued to pour in to prepare for the Okinawa invasion, that number eventually surged to a peak of 722 vessels. Managing an armada of this size was a highly coordinated, high-stakes maritime ballet.
Hundreds of heavy steel hulls, stretching completely to the hazy horizon, required a synchronized, unending flow of ammunition barges, fuel hoses, and supply tenders, operating relentlessly around the clock. The sheer physical weight of preparing the greatest invasion force of the Pacific War rested entirely on this improvised network of steel decks and reinforced coral. In the end, the Americans had not somehow erased the fundamental requirement for a naval port. A highly mechanized fleet still demanded the heavy maintenance, deep bunkers, and massive supply depots of a terrestrial harbor to survive. Instead, military planners had conceptually dismantled the traditional port. They broke its rigid shore-based functions down piece by piece and distributed them across a highly synchronized armada of service vessels, floating dry docks, and sunken pontoon piers. By severing the fleet's absolute reliance on concrete shores, they solved the geographic trap of the Pacific. The warships no longer needed to repeatedly retreat thousands of miles across the ocean to stay in the fight, because they no longer had to return to the industrial might of the continent. They had brought the industrial might of the continent with them. By transforming a remote, seemingly insignificant coral atoll into a sprawling, hybrid maritime metropolis, the United States military achieved something far greater than merely sustaining a relentless naval offensive.
They did not just solve the geographical paradox that had threatened to stall their advance, nor did they simply overcome the unforgiving tyranny of the Pacific Ocean distance to keep their heavily armored warships continuously in the fight. By engineering a massive industrial port that could literally drop anchor on the bleeding edge of the combat zone, they completely rewrote the fundamental rules of maritime strategy, turning the mundane, mathematical science of naval logistics itself into a devastating frontline weapon.